Great to be here. I really appreciate the organisation that goes into a conference. I've organised 5 regional Scrum gatherings in Sydney and Melbourne, and it's a lot of work. So thank you to Stanley, Salman and all the organisers, all the volunteers. Yeah, I really appreciate it. So this is a topic that everyone has an opinion on. I don't claim to have all the answers, but if you get some new thoughts and new thinking out of this little session, then I think that's what I'm seeking to achieve. And hopefully this ties in a bit with the theme of the conference, the business resilience, which I thought was a really exciting theme this year. This is about me. I've done a lot of Scrum training, a lot of coaching over the years. Maybe something to mention in this context is I'm a less friendly Scrum trainer, which means Best Photos pulled apart all my Scrum training in enormous detail and made sure it's all 100% less friendly. I've done a lot of training courses, including some with Learning Hub, which is basically next door here. So yeah, I have a little bit of association with Singapore. Some less adoptions I've been involved with. There's been quite a few sort of smaller ones, but to me what really opened my eyes was when I worked in the UK with a company called Conshango. Worked with Thomson Reuters, 160 people. It was basically less huge before it was called less huge. Had requirement areas. We called it splitting by lines of least dependency between the areas in the business context. Wargaming, now Riot Games had 7 teams work with 1 product owner, so saw, you know, the basic less, not less huge, I guess, work with that many teams with 1 PO. And Findex was a recent example. We had an executive play the product owner role, and there's actually, if you look on the other LeSS case studies on the LeSS website, you'll find a little link to a video. It's very informal. It's just a fireside chat with me and a Scrum Master talking about that LeSS adoption. So yeah, I saw different things that a lot of people would potentially be skeptical about and say that's not possible, actually be possible through these sorts of adoptions. Next year, I'm doing an executive MBA for my sins. 5 different modules in 5 different countries. So I was in France recently. I've got a bag from INSEAD over there. That's a business school in France. And yeah, also going to India in 1 week to do a module there. So part of what I'm trying to bring to this talk is a little bit of a business context. I'm really trying to get my head into what does the broader business community sort of think in terms of the relevance of things like resilience, adaptability, the sort of entry conversations into saying less might be something relevant for your business, for your context. So I think that's a lot of the challenge these days, right? To connect the dots from what business people believe they need to what we can offer. Not a huge amount of org design on the EMBA so far, but it does touch on some adaptability things. I won't talk a lot about this, but I would say that one thing that's really relevant now in talking about strategy is that strategy changes and evolves, and more frequently these days than it used to. And then that means that our org design to actually be fit for purpose for that business strategy will need to evolve. And I think that's one of the opportunities LeSS has to try to help organisations with evolving how we operate org design to fit the business strategy. All right, this is an agenda. I have more content on the slides than we'll have time for. I will sort of chop and change a little bit as we go. And we do have some interactive polls. We'll see how that works partway through. A few caveats. Yeah, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future, right? I am very tempted to say a few claims or hypotheses about what's going to happen with AI and orgs, but yeah, take them with a grain of salt. No one knows for sure. Some of the mainstream management things I'm going to show, I'm not claiming this is, you know, correct or wonderfully deep thinking. I'm just saying this is what your managers might be aware of, and it might be influencing their thinking, so it might be worth understanding from that perspective. There are quite a lot of studies. I might show some stats and things. That's not just product development or software development. So remember that things to do with more variable types of work, more, you know, creation of new products is not necessarily going to translate 100%. All right. So one thing I want to use in this talk a little bit is taking some ideas from perhaps innovators, early adopters out the front here. I think there's some interesting things emerging even with what people call AI native organisations, which again may or may not translate over the chasm to, you know, the big mainstream corporates and things, but it does give us some sort of existence proofs that certain things are real and happening, at least at small scale. And in some of these organisations, they're keeping the org very small while scaling the customers and scaling the impact, basically, and doing that more effectively using sort of AI. So resilience, that's a big theme of today and tomorrow. I'd just like to start with some definitions and maybe think, even beyond maybe the traditional definition of resilience. So, for starters, disruption feels real by the surveys. This is from the World Economic Forum. When I think about turbulence in the world, I start to think about geopolitics and supply chain disruption, COVID, and all these sorts of things. Turns out technology, cybersecurity and Gen AI are sort of top of the list here, which is kind of ironic, right? So we might be talking about that helping with dealing with resilience, but it's also on people's minds as maybe some sort of thing that they're concerned about. Maybe disrupting in a positive way, but at least being a big change influence in their business. Robustness, I thought I'd do an AI-generated video. So this is a big wall holding back the ocean, but can you imagine that this can be, with the right amount of turbulence or impact, damaged, and when it's damaged, it's not really able to recover. It could catastrophically fail, basically. So that's the concept with robustness. I'm going to use some graphs from a really nice paper from Hilton. I'd recommend having a look at if you find this interesting today. Just the performance level of an organisation, some sort of business, some sort of product development group perhaps, when it experiences some sort of stress, some sort of shock to the system, and this is like one big impulse, and this hits the point of catastrophic collapse basically there. This one here, it's a sustained, less intense stress, and it's, as you can see, degrading the performance. So this is a characteristic that plenty of traditional organisations go for when they try to put in systems and things in place to ensure that nothing bad happens, but there's the thresholds to that. It's not infinite perhaps, and it can fail and doesn't bounce back. It's not a self-recovering system, a self-recovering organisation. What about resilience? Maybe a metaphor with that would be bamboo in the strong wind, bouncing back. So it's resilient, it's recovering back to its former state. And that would be the traditional kind of definition, I think, of resilience, the bounce back. So it's preserving the status quo by going back to the status quo after some sort of stress to the system. So if we think about what that looks like, you've got this similar stress impact and the performance might degrade to some degree, but it's certainly not catastrophically failing altogether, and it's bouncing back to approximately how it was. Similar sort of thing here with sustained stress, it's again recovering. It's a self-recovering sort of system. By the way, I will share these slides afterwards, so there's going to be a few things you might take photos of and want to save you the bother. Gary Hamel, have you seen this guy? He's talked about how there's this resilience gap. The world is becoming turbulent. Remember, this was in 2003. I think things have only increased since then, faster than organisations are becoming resilient to deal with it. And I think in this last 12 months, we've seen a lot of that in lots of different dimensions. If you talk about resilience with technical people, they'll probably think about site reliability engineering or good old Simian Army from Netflix, some of the chaos engineering things. So there's lots of ways to engineer systems to try to help them restore themselves to a healthy state. And I guess we could start to think in that metaphor about restoring an organisation to a healthy state when it's got some sort of difficulty. So just thinking about how the term resilience has evolved. This is a sort of old definition. You can see it's really about absorbing stress, recovering, and critical things, kind of go back to how it was, and able to continue on. 2007, there's actually an ISO standard definition for resilience. Organisations can absorb and adapt to changing business environments. Adapt is an interesting word in there, and it talks about being able to survive and prosperity. So it's a little bit more adaptive, but it's perhaps not as ambitious as this statement here, which you can imagine in 2022 there'd been a cascading set of global crises, essentially with the pandemic and a lot of difficulties. World Economic Forum started talking about not just withstanding shocks, but being able to reinvent and innovate in response to disruptions. So yeah, it's actually talking about being better, perhaps ultimately, than it was before the disruption. You know, being able to adapt beyond what the status quo was. So yeah, this is a kind of line of thought that I think is becoming increasingly popular for people to start to connect resilience with adaptability and leveraging turmoil for advantage. And Gary Hamel has for a while had a term for that, strategic resilience. So it's not just about adjusting when you have a crisis, but actually preemptively changing before that becomes a crisis, basically. And again, this is indicating a little bit of going beyond the status quo. You're going to need to return to something that's perhaps a little bit more effective, given perhaps the new norm might be to sustain ability to operate effectively in a new environment. Who's heard of the term antifragility? Has that come up for anyone? I just thought I'd offer that today as another framing that maybe helps us think a little bit beyond the traditional definition, at least, of resilience. Just the metaphor I'm using here is, I guess, a child falling off a bike. And if that child, starts to learn from those experiences, it's hard to learn to ride a bike without actually doing it, without experiencing some sort of turbulence, some sort of wobbling, if not falling off the bike, and getting up and trying again, isn't it? And incorporating what we learn so that we're actually better than we were riding a bike previous to having those experiences. So yeah, it really goes to the opposite of fragility, which is not the same as resilience. The opposite of fragility, talking about actually learning and growing and self-improving through some sort of stress, some sort of turbulence, some sort of disruptive force basically entering into the system. So I think one thing to note about this, whilst this is I think a fantastic piece of work, Nassim Taleb's book, and it was really well regarded, it hasn't exactly taken off as a mainstream business kind of aspiration, I think, the antifragility. And so if you wanted to be a marketing person and saying, should we sort of present LeSS as a solution to being anti-fragile, may or may not be as effective perhaps as the resilience term if that's getting more buy-in. But at least it's a good thinking tool, I think, to think about what that looks like, even if we don't call it anti-fragility. So if you think about resilience versus anti-fragility, resilience was returning us to the status quo, like literally 100% of what we had previous to the incident, the stress. But anti-fragility, the idea is actually we return to something higher. So it's beyond the 100% once we've had that experience and we've actually grown from it, essentially. We've adapted in a way that's now more effective than it was before. Do we have stress in LeSS? Because if we didn't have any sort of impetus for some sort of stressor to the system, then this wouldn't be so relevant, I guess, this concept. I would argue that yes, when teams find themselves in a need to switch to types of work that require skills or knowledge that they simply didn't have before, things that are unfamiliar, things that require a bit of learning. Just one quick idea with that is we might have team skills like this, we might have a product backlog like that. The matchmaking exercise we do in sprint planning, that part one can be quite straightforward for this sort of team where they say, yippee, we've got an exact match with our skills and knowledge. But what about with the DEF? Doesn't match this one, doesn't match that one exactly. One of the challenges for teams is to think about, could we take that on, even though we've got a skills or knowledge gap, and do something called learning. We're going to slow down a little bit to spend a bit of time learning about whatever it is, the model context protocol or something we're trying to use for the first time ever. So that's, a really interesting principle that encourages some sort of turbulence, I guess, in the system that can encourage growth, can get us beyond the status quo. A few interesting principles, I won't talk too much there, but just the idea of it's better to do a high value thing slower, do the best value thing you can do a bit slower than to do something that's not the highest value, perhaps as fast as possible. This is the perhaps effectiveness versus efficiency thing. So there's a few strategies that help with anti-fragility or some sort of advanced form of resilience. Sensing shifts. So I think one strategy and less that can help with that is the product owner being really well connected with the domain. So high domain engagement, they might own the vision or product strategy, being very much in that market space. And I'm just going to throw up some ideas about how AI can contribute to that. So it's supporting perhaps what we're doing in LeSS, perhaps a way to have some synergy or enhancement of that. And one thing that I've been doing a bit with the EMBA is sense making, right? Which is a very useful technique these days with lots of emerging things. Like AI is a classic example, like sensing what some of the weak signals are of certain opportunities or threats or things that we should be starting to think about as a business to take advantage or thrive in that environment. So product owners, I think, can do well to have enhanced sense making, and of course AI can be doing that 24/7 with lots of interesting heuristics. Strategy 2, 3, I might skip something. Decentralization, right? That's one of the big strategies, I guess, in anti-fragility or resilience. I did this a while back, I guess, about all the different ways of coordinating in LeSS. These are more distributed ways of doing it, which are preferred, and these are more centralized ways of coordinating. And yeah, I think AI has a similar sort of idea with diversity of lots of agents. You've got decision making at the edges or periphery, I guess, closest to the information, and can have some sort of similar sort of things with like setting up agents in a nice distributed way. Redundancy is another principle. So if we think about having feature teams, we have overlap of competence and ability to work on components. For component B, we've got 3 teams that can all work on that, right? And so there's redundancy of skill, and sometimes there's a lot more work on component B, so that becomes really useful. And so this is sort of developing the muscle that allows us to pick up whatever we need to work on at the highest value, but in the case of resilience, it's ability to bounce back in ways that weren't anticipated, right? Experiments, right? There's an ecosystem of experiments idea with resilience and anti-fragility, and I actually counted the number of experiments at the end of the LeSS books. I think, 648. That's a real piece of work just to even document that many experiments, isn't it? In what Bass and Craig did in the early days. So yeah, very much grounded in that, and of course with things like not just the sprint retrospective, but the overall retrospective in LeSS. We are creating experiments, having a learning loop on that, and I think some great ways that AI can contribute to that with helping us sort of think through other opportunities for experiments or richer ways to do it, and to be able to do very scaled, very fast experimentation where it's possible with digital things. Knowledge retention. So that's a big one, to be able to not just capture things that might be insights for later reference, but be able to find them and leverage them. And of course, AI chat bots are fantastic to bring back things very quickly. This is the problem of knowledge management we've been trying to solve for decades, I guess, isn't it? But it's sort of on steroids with good AI training and retention. And one of the things that a lot of the anti-fragile resilient sort of principles talk about is a learning organisation, which is exactly what we aspire to with a LeSS organisation too. So here's a big summary. I know that's a lot of things, but does that make sense that there's some connections between anti-fragility, and this came to me even yesterday, and what we're already doing in LeSS? So in a way, the message I've got is that we're in a great position to be able to help organisations become more anti-fragile even, or have a fairly advanced form of resilience if we leverage these things in a systemic way. And not only that AI can contribute a whole lot of things to amplify that, or do a whole lot of the heavy lifting to really make that very effective these days as well. Is that making sense? I just want to get a quick reaction to that. Yeah, that's my wild idea for you today. There are some types of organisational anti-fragility. I won't spend a lot of time on this, just to say there's some really interesting things in this paper. If you want to unpack, for example, rheopetic anti-fragility, it's quite a mouthful. This is forming new novel structures to strengthen processes and relationships and things. And I do think that LeSS is really helping us with these sorts of foundational things, and there's an opportunity to kind of flow into how you might do some of the more structural elements as well. And just an example of that is communities. So communities to help with knowledge transfer and communities of practice, but also to come up with agreements, ways of doing things differently when there's a tension. LeSS has got a very dynamic way of creating and forming communities around those sorts of things. Volunteering being a big key principle, right? So it's not a top-down centralised approach so much, very much in line with the theory around fragility and anti-fragility, I mean. So just the Google Trends, again, these things are pretty rough and sometimes get misinterpreted, but there has been a big spike recently in some of these things. And again, just to say that anti-fragile term hasn't exactly taken off in a massive way over the years, but resilience is definitely on the upward, I think. All right, I'd like to talk about some AI adoption trends very briefly and get to some more meaty things in a sec too. If you look at the research about the impact of AI, I think people say that the impact with software engineering, product R&D is not necessarily just software though. Some of these things are really quite high up there. I'd like to get your take on where things are up to with your organisation's attitude to AI adoption. That QR code, I just realised it's a bit obscured, sorry. Have a read of this and then I'll try to make that QR code work for you. Which of these 4 attitudes, I know there's a lot of words, does your organisation have to AI adoption at this point? So just maybe have a quick skim read. Front runners. So this is understand the need, but really struggling to kind of work through the challenges of integrating it into the business. This is the sort of individuals having general understanding, but it's not really a priority, it's more just an ad hoc kind of thing. And the bottom one is just a bit confused, not really sure what the role is of AI in your business or organisation. Let me try to make that a bit easier to do. Can you get your phone on that QR code? Give me a thumbs up if you've got the poll coming up. Yeah, great. So going to, yeah, I think that should work, okay. Great, here's the responses. It's working. Yeah, I think there's a lot of this. But that's my gut feel. There's a lot of, especially in software product development, we've probably got some understanding of the need for this. But yeah, I guess as a holistic way to approach it, there's a lot of seemingly confusion out there and not so much clarity on how to proceed. Okay. By the way, I'm going to limit this poll to 40 people, and it's going to happen pretty quickly. So, thank you for getting quickly on that one. Let's see if we can put that. Yeah, great. Okay, so this relates to this matrix here. There's a sort of urgency and difficulty, kind of 2 by 2, and here's the stats in Australian small and medium businesses, I guess. So, yeah, interesting that we had a lot of white knucklers. That was the top one for this group. But tinkerers, I'm seeing a lot of that in Australia. There's little pockets of people tinkering. It's almost like a shadow IT thing to just open up ChatGPT and play around as an individual, but no sort of systemic way of approaching it very clearly. And there's a small amount of trailblazers and quite a lot of sleepwalkers still. A lot of people seem to be just waiting to see what emerges and what will fall in their lap. Pretty passive way to do it. Agentic AI has become the big buzzword, right? And that Gartner, I think it's the top of the hype cycle at the moment. Yet the thing I find interesting is so few businesses are really investing in it if they think it's an important thing. 81% of organisations have got a conservative or just not investing. So it's literally only that 90% that's having some sort of high investment in it so far. So what's the primary motivation, do you think, for AI adoption? Would you like to just think in terms of these possibilities and have another go on that poll? responses. Become more flexible, make better decisions. New revenue. Faster reporting. You see all these things coming up in surveys. All right, reduce costs is blown out to be the front runner. Yeah, we're trying to be realistic about what your colleagues are thinking, not necessarily what you personally think is the smartest move. And certainly, yeah, again, with my MBA, a lot of leadership sort of books and things are saying, let's make better decisions with this, which I think is quite nice, but turns out that, yeah, sorry, that's someone. Yeah, we could have a hypothesis saying the most popular way is to, focus is to reduce costs, and again, there's a little test card, a way to create a hypothesis and think about how you might test that. But yeah, the stats in Australia at least are showing like 57% out here. Efficiency, reduced costs, that's definitely the front runner. People are thinking this is a cost cutting exercise. Interesting, isn't it? Not necessarily the most advantageous thing for taking full benefits from what AI can offer. So here's an interesting one to think about. What's the shape of the payoff curve? Like if you start to implement AI in a pretty superficial, quick and easy sort of way, a lot of the things that have been going on so far, and maybe that's just sort of very small augmentation of what people are already doing, through to getting sort of semi-autonomous, having a human in the loop still, but going a bit deeper and further with what the data is it's using and the problems it's addressing. And full autonomy, I guess speaks for itself in terms of no longer needing a human in the loop for certain business processes, being able to do things that are perhaps creating value or even customer serving that, we just don't need to wait on a person for anymore. So what's the shape of the payoff curve? Hopefully I've got the words right here. Do you think it's linear, so that as we just keep on working away at extent of adoption, we keep on getting a linear amount of benefit overall? Do you think it's concave? Do we get quite a lot of benefit to start with and then it sort of tails off? Or do you think it's convex? So it's a bit slower to start with. And again, we have to think overall from a broader business or value creation perspective, not just sort of locally for what you might be doing in your tasks. We'll have a go at that, just a quick, and again, gut feel. It's not a highly analytical take on it today. Sorry, this is the responses I need to switch to, I think. Yeah. Beautiful, thank you. So I guess this can potentially make a big difference to the case for how you adopt a technology, right? If you don't get a lot of the big advantages till you do quite a big investment in it, or you need to take a fairly smart approach to how you invest in it, it can make a big difference. So convex seems to be the answer we've got there, fantastic. And that's what I'm seeing in things I've been looking at so far, and I'm sure there's more to come on this because it's definitely one of the big questions to see the real return on investment. But yeah, let's talk of organisations prioritising the core functions and really not just having a diffuse, almost ad hoc kind of approach to it, are seeing much bigger returns than people that are just doing the ad hoc thing. But you also hear a lot of hype about bottom up and a lot of advice to executives even saying just help everyone, empower them all to do their own thing with little chat GPTs and things like that. And again, I don't think that's a systemic approach that's going to result in the biggest payoffs. Or really help us think about org design in relation to this too. So processes, going to take us through one kind of element of org design here and then sort of zoom out again and see how much we have time for at the end. How much is current use of AI in software development improving overall performance? And performance, I know, is a very hard thing to quantify in this sort of area, but just imagine we're talking about overall throughput, if you know of the DORA metrics, quality KPIs. So these are relatively measurable things, even though they might not be the same as value. So just roughly 1,000%, that's a 10x or 100% increase. What gut feel do you suspect the current improvement is, the impact of AI so far? And this is in software development, and this is beyond your one team. Perhaps this is more at scale. Interesting. There's all sorts of answers coming up here. Yeah, 20%, 50%, minus 20%. It could be. I've seen, I didn't put it in this deck, but I've seen some things saying, for greenfields work, there's typically, more improvement potential. There is potentially some downside to it, it should be negative. But for non-greenfields, brownfields things, there's actually quite a lot of negative. People are spending more time trying to clean up after the AI's work than actually getting forward progress. Got all vibe coding and all the kind of things that's kind of leading to. So the prototyping versus trying to work with non-trivial code bases. Yeah. So again, good to formulate a hypothesis like you're all sort of doing when you respond to that poll. People would probably tend towards this one. It's got to be improving things, right? Well, a study that came out very recently says it's actually no overall increase in performance measurable by those particular metrics I just mentioned. Basically nothing. It's really team level gains locally kind of look like something, but when you look at it more systemically as the broader product group perhaps, or the broader organisation, it's really not coming across as major improvement or anything meaningful. So why? I think this is a good way for us to start to think as system thinkers, maybe put on your lean cap a little bit, think about constraints and things. Bit of a hint. Let's have a go at this one. A lot of people might say the first one, culture, insufficient leadership support, AI tools not yet mature enough. I think there could be quite a lot of people saying that out there. I think I gave it away, this one. All right. What's really going on where we have got a bunch of teams and we're trying to see the impact of this across the group. Okay. Yeah, so here's what the authors of that study say. It's number one, downstream bottlenecks cancel out the gains. Okay, so many groups have more than one step in their value stream or value creation process. Put AI into one part of it, maybe the coding, and you've got something downstream from that that's just not keeping up. It's really classic theory of constraints or lean flow thinking, I guess. If we had the human, like one programmer, one tester, just to make it super simple, 1 unit a day, let's say, in both of them, the pipe is about equal. We've kind of leveled that out, the capacity, and then suddenly we put all these agents into it. Let's have auto-generated code with all these wonderful tools, and then we've got loads more coming through there, but we've not got loads more coming through there. I think it's a pretty simple sort of equation in a way. But this is where we need to look much more broadly at what's going on in organisations. And again, we've got the tools for this in the lean sort of principles from way back, and the LeSS books really kind of talk to this. So who's read things like this in one of the LeSS books? That the ratio of value added time in the end-to-end from, it could be, something going on the product backlog through to it being, in the hands of customers, is typically maybe even 5%. Right, so about 95% of the end-to-end is actually not value-added time. It could be idle time or activities that are not value-adding. So let's assume that for a second. Let's assume that you've got 5% of the overall is value-adding time, and we put a lot of effort into implementing AI for the value-added time. And in fact, we get a 50%, so that 50% reduction to the value-added time. So what overall improvement have we made to the lead time with that? All right, just let me come back to that at CLD because I've got a little bit. Actually, let me go back to this way of putting it. All right, let's do a hands up on this. Manual poll this time. Who would say 100% improvement? We've made a 50% improvement to the value-added time. Who would say 50%? Who would say 5%? Who would say 2.5%? It's like, congratulations, you put all this effort into improving that value-added time, but it's only a 2.5% improvement from the overall lead time perspective. So again, this is not a lens that people are necessarily putting into it. If they're not a lean thinker, they're not really coming into it from an end-to-end value stream perspective. But I think we could do that. I will just pop this causal loop diagram up briefly. Who's actually seen a CLD, a causal loop diagram? This is a pretty quick and dirty one, but just imagine we're doing bottom-up adoption of AI, like a lot of organisations seem to be doing currently. There can be like localised measures and incentives, you know, who's the champion of the worker of the month on doing the neatest thing with their tasks on AI and things like that. You tend to think if we increase the localised measures and incentives and do this big, rah-rah rollout of here's all your tools, go use them, go figure it out yourself, it's probably going to lead to an increased number of people locally optimising what they do, isn't it? Within the scope of their control, within their tasks, their personal things. That, especially if it's measured from a local perspective and people are sort of showing that off, it's probably going to create a perception, an increased perception of overall improvement from the local improvement. This is this big misunderstanding that local improvements lead to, well, they just roll up just linearly to the overall improvement in a system. Not necessarily the case. Okay, so that could lead to more investment and sort of saying, let's do more of that. It seems to be having people enthusiastic and doing lots of good things individually. But yeah, more local optimization, around the loop we go, and overall improvement. And it may not show up till a bit later when we start to look a bit more holistically. It's actually going down. It's not actually necessarily going up. Does that make some sense? That's a possible dynamic we could have here. So I think the big message out of this is we need to look more systemically at how we're implementing AI if we're going to get away from that big trap of local optimization degrading the whole. Just want to propose some thoughts, and these are just some initial thoughts on how we might navigate with AI adoption as relates to that sort of more holistic, systemic way of looking at it. First of all, what is our organisation to be optimised for? Okay, and this is a big topic in LeSS adoptions. Say, really, is it adaptability? Is that really what we need here? Is it something else? Sense emerging tensions, and there are a lot of them, right? There's not just, am I going to lose my job type tensions. There's a lot of tensions even in who's accountable if now computers and AI things are making decisions. Like, do we have to attach like a human one-to-one with that? I think IBM came out in the 70s saying you must always have a human accountable for anything a computer does, because computers just aren't accountable. Right? There's all these kind of wild and weird problems we start to run into. Generate and evaluate options. Okay, and this is where we can go back to some principles and say, can we look at it from a systems thinking perspective? Can we look at it from some of our org design thinking? And there's even reflecting on what we've learned previously, and I've got an example of that even in other sorts of transformational changes, right? In the Agile space, we've been through a lot of successful and unsuccessful changes, and we should learn, perhaps especially from those unsuccessful ones, what might happen with this sort of transformation. And yeah, emerging solutions, I just find it interesting, some of the AI native startups and things, and then experiment, as you probably imagine I'd say, iterate, and when we evaluate things, evaluate relative to the whole. This came up on the org topologies course yesterday. Terry has a better graphic. Yeah, but the point being, like, we're not just doing adaptiveness for the sake of it, right? Or just, there's some sort of reason. It should come from the business strategy. So again, going back to what is our strategy, let's get the leaders to really think deeply about what capabilities they need to actually fulfill that. I've been working with people on a lot of optimizing goal cards. These are sort of the descriptions of some of them. I'll just flick through them, but just to know that that's a thing you can do to help to get some of these things in place, right? Stable, optimizing goals, whilst we try to create lots of adaptability and flexibility about some of these other sorts of things. So again, like LeSS has got some really nice patterns just about what we actually make quite stable in order to create lots of flexibility and adaptability about other things, if adaptability is in fact what you're after, or resilience or anti-fragility. Who's come across the STAR model, the Galbraith STAR model? That's probably one of the centerpieces now in the community around how we think about org design. And yeah, again, coming out of those optimizing goals, the big point is these things all need to be coherent, as in aligned. And when we start to make a change to one, we might need to start to think about the change to others. Otherwise, they're going to be out of alignment, it's going to be less effective and friction. So what have we learned from failed Agile adoptions, especially fake Agile adoptions that have just changed essentially processes, maybe some lightweight relabeling of structures, but not fundamental rethinking of structures? I would suggest that we've learned that creates friction, right? And it creates ineffectiveness in the whole because you've changed this, but you haven't changed these other things. The rewards, incentives, the people practices, it hasn't all been kind of rethought holistically to be effective. Does that make sense? And same thing can happen with AI adoption, I would say. Maybe just a quick show of hands. Which one of these do you think would be the biggest initial impact of AI adoption? Strategy? Structure? Processes, which includes the information flows? Any chance of that? Rewards? Okay. People, skills, mindsets. I mean, there's sort of, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I was going to riff off particularly the, let's look past this. Yeah, just the information, the vast amount of information that could be quite generic, right, out of LLMs, and just the access to that, and also people trying to hack processes using AI-based bits and pieces, isn't it? There's quite a lot of very direct impact to this sort of space. And what I'd suggest is that can create friction with all these other elements in your design. No longer are the structures or the rewards of the people sorts of things actually really kind of the right fit to the new information flows and the new processes and things people are trying to hack into that. So yeah, again, we're not thinking holistically if we're not thinking about how that all needs to be fit. I think policies is another big one that Craig Larman has raised on that. What will just happen if we start dropping in AI all over the place, right? All these agents and bits and pieces, little tools across all these different teams. This is not LeSS, by the way. This is a sort of an anti-LeSS pattern with separate product owners per team almost and backlogs per team. It's really kind of just locally optimizing in these little silos of capacity, isn't it? Working on different, perhaps pieces of the business process or different components. So you've got component teams here, essentially, steps in a claims, perhaps business process there. So I think the main takeaway is the question, is your organisation sub-optimising the parts? Yeah, sort of sacrificing the whole, or sub-optimising the whole for the parts? Compromising the parts for the whole? Compromising the whole for the parts. That's another way of putting it. That made more sense. And it might look like this. It's a bit of a metaphor, right? And if you're not careful, these wonderful things we do with these cars might actually be hitting the sheep and damaging the overall system, I guess, you might be interested in. All right, so final things. I'll just wrap up on this sort of hypothesis for something to talk about through the conference. If we don't take a more systemic, more thoughtful approach to AI adoption and use some of the approaches we have in the LeSS community, it's really just going to amplify the weaknesses in the org design. Does that make some sense? Like it's just going to hit the existing bottlenecks harder. It's just going to have people double down on the local optimizations in the pieces, not the whole. And yeah, I think that's short-sighted, and I think it's the sort of thing that it's kind of human nature for a lot of people, unfortunately, and the sort of thing that a lot of other communities might miss. So I think the neat thing about what we've got going on is we've got a lot of tools that can help us do better than that. Just to flick up some ideas, these are pretty common things we hear about at LeSS conferences. Look familiar? Systems thinking. So having clarity on what we're optimizing for, perhaps a perfection vision, and servicing mental models, causal loop diagramming. So just that very simple bottom-up one. There's lots and lots of ones you could do with managers who are trying to make decisions about how we adopt AI. Lean, we saw an example of a value stream or just flow, and just the idea of needing to rethink how that works to be a bit more smooth when you've got things at different paces doing different things. And yeah, org design, trying to get the elements in sync. We can't just change processes in a radical way and expect everything else to be coherent with that. Org topologies, I didn't put stuff in there because Alexi's here and we've got lots of other sessions we could talk about that. But yeah, there's definitely lots of opportunity, I think, for AI to help to move in the vertical dimension, particularly around better understanding the problem space, the domain, broader scope of work mandate for teams. I can get access to things, but we still need to talk to real customers, real human beings, of course. And a lot of the LeSS principles are super relevant for a lot of these sorts of things too. Again, can we optimize the whole, not just the parts? And yeah, just to finish up, I think I started out talking about resilience, how we can think about the anti-fragility angle on that. LeSS, I think we've got some really nice strategies that are just really aligned to these sorts of outcomes. But the messaging might be to try to find business leaders who actually care about resilience or care maybe about that anti-fragility side of things and start to connect the dots for them to sort of say, let's take a systemic sort of view on this. Let's try to use some of our thinking tools from LeSS. And I just think, yeah, we can do a lot of great stuff building trust too. And that takes a campaign of effort around having a lot of different ways to think about what do people need to be convinced of to think that AI is going to be sufficient for the job, and we can start to get full advantage rather than just being a very ad hoc approach to it. Thank you, everyone. I know that was a lot, but I'm very happy to talk about it for the rest of the conference. Thanks a lot.